Hello, everyone. I'm Davy Jags, and this is Sparkle On. Sparkle is your happiness, passion, and self worth, and is found through the power of creativity. We've never been in greater need of resilience, yet we've never understood it more. Dr. Sherry Hamby is the author of Stronger Than You Think, Building Lifelong Resilience, and is an award-winning professor at the University of the South with over 30 years of studying resilience and trauma. She busts the myth that resilience is either something that you have or don't, and instead is a modifiable process and what it means to put the pieces of your life back together and live a good life.
I'm standing and I'm shouting out.
I'm going to start by asking the question that most people are afraid to ask. Do you think people need to experience trauma in order to have resilience?
Yeah, that is a great question. And I totally think you're right. I think it's a question that a lot of people wonder about. I get that question a lot. And the answer is no. I mean, it is definitely like a very strong no. You can work on the strengths that will help you with life's ups and downs at any time in your life. And also, I think maybe even more importantly and harder for some people to understand because there are so many other messages out there about it, but you don't need trauma to develop your strengths. You can get stronger without experiencing trauma. Getting stronger will help you with whatever does come your way, but it's not a built-in part of the process that trauma is somehow good for you. Trauma is definitely not good for you.
Yeah, and I think that's what caught my eye so much about your work and your book when you guys reached out was because as someone that has experienced a lot of trauma, as I do my gender-based violence advocacy work as well, there's a lot of survivors like myself that have almost, reservations about the word resilience. And it's even more ironic because my favorite word is relentless. And that comes a lot from my athletic identity and how I was raised. But, these two meanings have changed and evolved in my life over time. But one of the things that is so important to the mission of this show, Sparkle On, is that sense of purpose. And what I found in my experiences, especially other survivors' experiences as well, was that they have this lost sense of purpose. And you dive deep into that in your book, Stronger Than You Think. What are questions that you would tell people to ask when they are trying to either discover their sense of purpose or rediscover, especially in the wake of trauma?
Yeah, sure. I think that there are a lot of ways to explore that. I'm a big fan of narrative, and I think if you're trying to figure out what your sense of purpose is and what you want to commit yourself to, that sometimes exploring with narrative is a good way to go. Uh, some of my favorite ways to do that include just trying to look back on your life and think about some of the times that were most impactful for you or where you felt most valued or most fully yourself, and really thinking about what was happening in those times. Were you volunteering? Were you helping someone? Like what sort of things were in place with that? And I also think it can help to cast your mind forward too. And something I encourage people to do a lot is to imagine that it's 5 years from now or 10 years from now. And where would you like to be and what were you hoping to achieve? And or imagine that you're getting some kind of award from your community as volunteer of the year or from your workplace or school. Like what would you want them to be recognizing about you? And sometimes that can help you figure out what's most important to you.
Yeah, and I'm curious to know, what was the catalyst for you specifically? You write about how even this book is part of your purpose, the resilience research that you've done over 30 years. What was the catalyst that even got you involved in this?
Well, I grew up in a home where both of my parents really struggled with alcoholism and depression. And I did what a lot of children in those kinds of dysfunctional homes do. I got adultified at a pretty early age. I mean, that's almost the defining feature, I think, of children of alcoholics. I'm also the oldest child in my family, so I think I got a little bit nudged in that direction anyway. And that is something that when I was 7 or 10 or even 15, little kids don't necessarily have a lot of resources. And I try to be gentle now when I look back on that child and what she did to kind of make it through all of that. But I think that I took some messages from what I did to survive back then that ended up not being very helpful to me, that I tended to over rely on toughness and self-reliance, and I'm not very good. I mean, even now, even today, I still have to really work on asking for help when I need it because I do not like asking for help. Uh, and funnily enough, I mean, the field of psychology has made some of the same mistakes with that, like our early work on resilience. And I think maybe going back to what you were just saying about why some people don't like that word, is that in a lot of circles it has become kind of equivalent to toughness or grit or determination or just pushing through. But that's not really how people heal from trauma. And most of us need other things in our lives to heal from trauma too. And as I got older and got better at realizing that I was over relying on the same strategies over and over again, I got interested in uh, doing more to listen to my patients who just wanted to feel better, or my students or my loved ones, and trying to help figure out what are those pathways to healing and what are all the factors that are involved.
And why do you think that so many people, whether it's research or societal norms, like why do you think people conflate resilience with toughness? And what were the barriers that you have faced in academia specifically to kind of demystify any of those?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. Well, I think it depends on where you are and what community you're in. I think most of the research on resilience has been done in the US, and even more specifically in sort of like mainstream US culture.
Mhm.
And uh, and I think it's been a very sticky idea because we are just in love in our culture with this sort of cowboy mentality and this rugged individualism and all that sort of stuff. And so some of the early ideas about resilience, even though people started like back in the 1970s and 80s, I'm going back to now, like even though some other psychologists started pushing back on some of these ideas right away, I think they've been very sticky because they fit into a lot of our cultural values. I don't think that's true in a lot of places, and I think that's why you get pushback on the idea in a lot of places. And in academia, yeah, academia, I mean, you'd think that science in an ideal world would be really great at like testing a new idea, figuring out if it's right or wrong, or maybe if pieces of it are right or pieces of it are wrong, and ditching the wrong parts and then just moving forward into new domains as fast as you can. But in fact, that's not actually how academic research works. And for a lot of different reasons, academic research can be very conservative, and it's a lot easier to get grants and to publish your papers if you're using questionnaires that are familiar to people, if you're citing previous researchers who are well known in the field. And so sometimes a bad idea, if it did catch on at all, can be really hard to get rid of because people are like, but that's the questionnaire that everybody uses. And I'm like, yeah, but that's a really lousy questionnaire. And so that has definitely been a struggle. But as you said, I've been doing this for 30 years, and that I think has been a big benefit to me because I do have a lot of professional capital. I'm a senior researcher, and so I think I can get away with saying some things that it might be harder for more junior scholars to say.
And in the early days of your career, like what were some of the conversations where you kind of came into that voice to get people to care about your perspective on resilience and kind of busting the norms around what was done before you?
Yeah, that has, I mean, I think that there's been a lot of different conversations about them. I mean, some of the ones that stick in my mind are really more from, like I said, clients or students or loved ones reaching out to me. And because the norm in the early days of my career was still almost all of the science was focused on documenting rates and risk factors and
Hmm.
negative consequences. And that was really important work. I mean, that is what put violence on the table as this really big public health problem. And it is, for example, probably the reason that you mentioned you worked in with gender-based violence. I mean, it's probably the reason that organizations like the ones that you've worked with are getting funded is because of that work. But like I said, I mean, they just kept coming and they're being like, "Yeah, we know it's really bad, Sherry, and but what we want to know is what to do about it and how to feel better, and just documenting that something is really bad." Um, I mean, as far as pushing back on it, it's just a matter of trying different ways and communicating different angles and trying to create opportunities for people to do that. Like some of the things we've done, for example, recently is we've guest edited a couple of special issues in some scientific journals in the field. And I think that has been a very impactful thing to do because it means that when they put together their studies that they know that there's going to be an outlet where they can publish it, and we've been able to help them find places, some other researchers to find places to publish it. So we're doing that kind of work, trying to make it easier for other people to do this strengths-based work.
And why this book is great too, though, it really is speaking more to the masses versus maybe other works that you've published in your academic career, breaking it down in really simplified processes and examples. And one of the things that you mentioned before was narrative writing, and I think in the wake of my own trauma, I turned to writing as a modality. Before, my athletic identity was my sole purpose, and when that was
Mm.
destroyed, I went searching for that purpose and identity again. And I started writing letters to someone who betrayed me deeply as a way to heal. But that's how I discovered I was a writer. And so, why do you think trauma itself unlocks parts of ourselves that we didn't know were necessarily there?
Well, I do think that writing is a really powerful way to gain some perspective on things and to understand some of the connections and links between what has happened to us. It can be a way to put some emotional distance from things and to start understanding that our immediate reaction doesn't have to be the reaction that we carry with us forever into our futures. But I wouldn't say that trauma unlocks things because I think that starts to get back to this sort of what doesn't kill you makes you stronger
Hmm.
idea. And I definitely wouldn't want to say that. So I think it is extremely well documented that even low levels of trauma have negative effects, not just on our psychological health, but also on our physical health. It's associated with higher rates of cancer, heart disease, diabetes, just all kinds of health problems. I think the part that but I do think that that feeling of unlocking is genuine. But I think it's the writing. I think it's that bringing that strength into your life that's unlocking something and helping you gain some deeper insights into your life. And that, but you didn't have to. have a trauma to benefit from that kind of
Right.
writing. Like if you had done that kind of writing because you, I don't know, took a class at the university or something like that, you could have unlocked some of those talents from a non-traumatic pathway too. And it probably, all else being equal, would have been nicer for you if you could have found a way to unlock all your talents without having to experience the trauma.
I agree. I think I would have come around to it eventually, but I think it's one of those things where sometimes you are in conversation, and I feel like even from a media perspective, we glorify what you said, the what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. Without those experiences, you wouldn't be who you are. And it's like, I think there's healthier ways to come into yourself. I think with trauma, and with, at least I'm just speaking from my experience, is like it the experience of trauma and the desire to want to come back to yourself forces you to do that in whatever it means to, feel that strength again. And for me, it was writing, but it's almost like it accelerates that growth, and that's even problematic for saying that. And I think that's where, like, your book really lays out a groundwork of, like, because you talked about different case studies of people that, like, either have already experienced trauma, or like yours was, even how I read it, was even like a preventable approach to, if you go through hardship at some point in your life, which most people, everyone does, here are
Sure.
ways to practice that. And I think what I found was super interesting was your point on how the medical world doesn't view the arts as heavily as something like medication. Could you speak to that point and what that means, especially from your point of the step one, the mobilization?
Sure. And I think that goes back to what we were talking about earlier about how conservative the field can be. And so originally, going all the way back to Sigmund Freud and people like that, that
Mm.
therapy was modeled after the office visit to go see a physician. And you'd come into the office and you'd chat for a few minutes about what your problems are. And then the doctor would, say something, and then your idea is you feel better and you go home. And that's something that we have also stuck to way longer than we should, because we now have pretty extensive evidence, I mean, from a lot of different modalities, that that is not the most effective way to make people feel better who've experienced trauma, or who are experiencing a lot of other psychological problems too. I mean, if you have depression or anxiety for other reasons that aren't related to trauma, but we have been really stuck with it. And I do talk in several places about the book about doing, nature-based interventions or art interventions, and when and never really, and being taught that those aren't as serious as the real therapy. I've worked in domestic violence shelters and psychiatric hospitals and all kinds of clinics, and in most of those residential spaces, sometimes they will offer mindfulness or art therapy or something like that, but most of the time that was just treated as filler for the day until you could have like your real therapy meeting with your therapist, where you're just sitting in an office and chatting. But now we know that a lot of those other modalities are actually going to have at least as big an impact on your symptoms and your pathway to healing as sitting in an office doing cognitive behavioral therapy. And I think it has been hard for people to, because I think a lot of places they feel like they're giving up some of the status if it seems less like a medical visit. But
Mm.
I think the focus really should be on what helps people the most, and you can get more help from doing these other things.
And you even mentioned psychedelics in that work, and how, some are even treating that understanding or advancement or whatever you'd like to call it, possibly more than the arts. And I'm curious to understand, what do you think the future of that healing pathway is?
Well, as I talk about in the book, I think about psychedelics in much the way that I think about mindfulness. Mindfulness has been around for more than 2,500 years. And when I was your age, it was treated as this very sort of flaky woo-woo thing that wasn't serious serious therapy or practice or a way of being in the world. But once science got serious about it, then they found that this practice that has survived in thousands of years in all these different cultures actually does really promote well-being. And there have been recently some very big studies that show that it probably works at least as well, if not better, than cognitive behavioral therapy. And I think about psychedelics in much the same way. I think in terms of traditional practices, I mean, from my own personal point of view, is that you have to sort out what kinds of things they were doing that are similar to what we would still be doing. So, as far as, for example, like they didn't understand how germs cause disease many
Hmm.
centuries ago because they didn't have microscopes and the other kinds of technology that you need to figure that stuff out. So I don't think that we should necessarily go back to 1,000-year-old model of illness and then it's like your wandering womb or whatever is what's making
Yeah.
you feel bad because we understand anatomy and biochemistry and things like that much better than we do. But when terms of therapies, psychotherapies, what they were looking at is not that different than what we're still looking at are changes in your health and well-being. And so I think for psychedelics like mindfulness have been around for thousands of years and used in many different cultures as a path to for healing and transformation and uh, you know, coming of age rituals and all kinds of other things. And I think that it has potential to really be an important therapy that should be probably more accessible than it is.
Yeah, I think like that's where I feel like in the last year I've researched a lot more about it as a healing modality because I think growing up there was a stigma that it was in the same realm of like all drugs, all alcohol, and it's not because like alcohol is just making you more depressed, whereas I think you even said it in your book is the psychedelics are actually changing something in your brainwaves and nerves to make you think differently in a way that's like promoting resilience in your life and relinquishing the trauma that lives within your body and all the ways that it actually physically impacts you, not just mentally. So I'm curious to see more of that kind of research as time goes on. But one of my favorite anecdotes specifically, especially as a writer, was your anecdote of Joyce, who she what you found working with her was that the therapy that she was experiencing. So for the listeners here, and I hope you read it in the book, but Joyce was changing congregational churches, and she basically it was for families that had either like people in their other families that had endured sexual abuse. And Joyce was very religious, and going into this new church, no one had actually asked her what her relationship was with religion. It was hyper focused on what her son and her family has endured. And I think that's a really important point. And Sherry, you mentioned the context of trauma and how instead of surrounding one event, why it's really, really vital to focus on the context. Can you take us more into like the behind the scenes of what your work and what your questions look like into kind of extracting what that context is for a person?
Yeah, sure. So in the case of Joyce, we were doing interviews where we were trying to explore all of the different things that help people on their resilience journeys. And she showed up into the interview wearing this t-shirt that just said Jesus across it in these like giant letters. And so it wasn't really any very big secret that she was a religious person. And when we got to the religion and spirituality section of the interview, I acknowledged that she was wearing I mean, it just seemed like an obvious thing to acknowledge that she was wearing this giant t-shirt that said Jesus on it. And it did turn out that religion was incredibly important to her. And as you said, that she was actually also going through some challenges with her religious life because she'd left a church that she'd been at for a long time after some conflict. She'd been in the choir. She'd been kind of an important person in that church, and then she really felt, I think, disappointed and betrayed by the minister there, and then she'd gone to this other church and she just didn't have that same sense of community and closeness there yet. And I think that's a very big uh, you know upheaval for people, if not outright trauma, in terms of the feelings of betrayal and stuff about how she was treated and felt bullied by the other people at the first church. And because the therapy was using this manualized approach to working through families where the children had experienced sexual abuse, they had actually never gone into this topic at all. And I think maybe even more importantly, I mean, I do think it is very important that all therapists should be finding out what the roles of religion and spirituality are in their clients' lives. But it's also they just weren't checking in with what's going on with them now. Like the therapy was totally focused on this sexual abuse incident that had happened, by the time I met Joyce and her son, more than 2 years previously, which I know is not necessarily a long time on a healing journey, but for a small child, 2 years is a very long time. This little boy is only like 10 years old, and he probably barely remembered that person. And uh, I think what was going on now in their lives was much more important. And I do think it really shows the limitations of a lot of our approaches to therapy, that people get into our systems because they're labeled as sexual abuse victim or domestic violence victim or bullying victim or whatever, and then all of the services get organized that one label, but everybody is more than whatever our traumatic experiences have been. And we need to bring that more into the therapy so that we're focusing on what do they need now in their lives. And of course, for them, having some joyful and meaningful practice of their religion was an incredibly important part of their current life. And when that was disrupted, it just wasn't getting integrated into the therapy at all. But in the book, it does have a happy ending because Joyce did go and talk to her therapist with a little nudging from me, and uh, they did manage to deviate from the manual long enough to pay attention to that and had a much better outcome. And then I did actually hear from that therapist a few weeks later about how helpful that had been for them to talk about that and how that had really changed and deepened their relationship and moved the healing forward in very positive ways. But I do think it is a good example that we should never think of a survivor just in terms of their traumatic experiences.
Absolutely. And I'm not sure why, but it made me kind of like start thinking about like younger generations' relationship to social media. I know that seems like a complete tangent, but I think what it really made me realize was, because it was partly into like reading it in full of like you're stressing the importance of storytelling. And what I felt like with Joyce, you were able to see her in a way that she maybe hadn't been seen for the first time in a long time since, changing churches. And I think that's a really important part. But with younger generations' relationship with social media, it's always being seen. And I think that plays into what you were even saying about authenticity versus performative meaning making. And I'm curious to know what and how does someone show up to telling their story, whether it be a character like Joyce, but specifically maybe on social media as an experimental tool for self-expression. How do we find that line or analyze that we are remaining authentic versus performative with that context that we're not being defined by our trauma? I know that's a loaded question.
Yeah, I mean, that is a really important question, and I think that it's really important to understand the difference between being exposed and being seen. And I do
Mm,
think that we are way more exposed in our modern lives than we have ever been before. And not just on social media. I mean, you're probably on on video when you go into the store, or maybe even at like a traffic light or at the airport, or we're constantly being recorded and exposed, and we don't have the same levels of privacy that we used to have. But I'm not sure that with all of that sacrifice of our privacy, that it's made it easier to get seen in the way that I think Joyce felt in the interaction that she and I had. In fact, if anything, I think it's actually harder to really be truly seen now, because it's very hard. I mean, I struggle with it myself. I mean, as you will know well, when you're as a writer, as a podcaster, that you're trying to communicate with your audience. We're always being sort of gently nudged to try to grow our audience and the number of people who know about us. And that's why we're both here today, right? And it's hard to do that in a way that does feel authentic. And I do, I mean, I struggle, almost every day with how to communicate with more distant people, or maybe people I've never met, and still communicate what I think it would be helpful for them to know, without it just seeming performative, or I don't know, like an assignment or something like that. And I do think that social media is kind of a weird space about that, because I think a lot of the people who are online a lot actually don't like it very much. And I mean, that's what some of the people I know who have way bigger followings than I do on any kind of social media, they don't seem to like it. They find it a chore. They complain about it when there isn't a mic on them. And but unlike a lot of things that we have to do for work, we have to pretend that we like it when we're posting on social media, or and in a way that I think does pull for more performative kinds of behaviors. There are other things that I have to do for pursuing my science and pursuing my mission to reduce the global burden of trauma. Uh, like, filling out grant reports and things like that I also don't like doing, but I don't have to pretend that I like doing them while I'm
right.
doing them. I can sit there and grumble away while I'm filling out all those forms, and what is mostly what I do when I'm filling them out. So I do love talking to people, and I do love connecting with people, and I imagine that's probably true for you, since you've made that such a big part of your life. But I, yeah, and I don't know. I really struggle with figuring out. I mean, I don't know if I have the answer to your question. I think it's very hard to figure out how you can make those connections with the people that you want to hear them. I mean, the whole reason I wrote the book is because I think it is very hard for the general public to get good up-to-date information on what the science is telling them about how, like I said, that you don't have, what I tell people all the time is that I think it's very sad when I see anybody getting the kind of therapy that I was taught to do when I was in graduate school in the 1980s and 90s, that nobody should be doing that kind of therapy anymore because there are lots of better options out there that have been developed in the last 10 or 20 years. But I still see people getting 20th century versions of psychotherapy all the time instead of 21st century versions. And so I am really committed to trying to get that message out, but I think it's very hard to navigate these very bizarre social media spaces in a way that allows you to pursue that mission or try to share what you think is important in ways that that don't end up making you feel like you have to act like you're having lots of fun coming up with, quippy little things to say every day, because I don't enjoy that part of it.
Oh,
So
try.
I
I
don't know if
mean,
that really answers your question.
I think what I take from it is what you said very simply is it's about the connection that you and Joyce had, and social media has provided a engine to have possibly have those connections in person or like how we're having here over Zoom, and I'm grateful for that. But I always go back to what they say very simplistically, like if your post doesn't perform and you don't get 1,000+ likes, if you had 1,000 people come up and tell you that they liked your outfit, you would be extremely overwhelmed and you would be very excited and overstimulated, and it would be all the things. 5 likes is reasonable for human interaction before social
Yeah.
media. Now, I think what's from your response, it's also like in a way you have to ask yourself, because of what we live in as a society with being exposed, is we are living in a world where we need resilience more than ever. It's not only misunderstood, but more and more the world is not created in a way that's set up to have this connection that we're talking about, to have the tools
Yeah.
to be resilient in maybe the ways that we've seen in generations prior. So it's not only the importance of this book, where we're at now with understanding resilience, but what does that future look like? And I think maybe that becomes a larger discussion beyond this episode, but I think it's one of those things where absolutely, like in my work on social media, I feel that that extreme pressure that it doesn't leave enough space for that processing of even just the day, because you're just trying to pump out as much content as possible to service your purpose and mission. Like, don't get me wrong, it can feel like you're on track, but it's the volume at which that you have to shout from the rooftops. So I think that's where I personally get exhausted, is that it's the content overload and the way the actual technology amplifies people that are just machines. And I think from your work, we know
Yeah.
that nobody is a machine. That doesn't last forever.
Right. Yeah, I think it is the volume and the way the algorithms are. I mean, I do think, I have made some wonderful connections with people over social media and met some people I would not have otherwise met. And some of them are, people I have like in-person relationships with now. But I think that, I wish there was some way we could sort of go back to what the algorithms were in 2010 or maybe even 2015, because they just, in that capitalist way, they're just getting like more and more exploitive and more extractive. And I was reading something yesterday on Substack where someone was like, "Well, don't try to worry about publishing, writing something more than every 3 or 4 hours." I'm like, every 3 or 4 hours. I'm like, I'm still a scientist. I'm still conducting studies, and I have, other things too. Like I have a family and I have dogs that need walking, and I just, I feel like that I don't think it is helpful for the things that I care about, that we are just constantly trying to broadcast things like, oh, well, since this morning, I've actually accomplished like three more things I want to tell you about on social media. I mean, since this morning, I have worked on a bunch of things that are important to me, but honestly, most of that stuff is going to take a lot longer before it comes to fruition than what the social media algorithms want. And I think it's in a lot of cases pushing people to do less thoughtful and impactful work than they're capable of.
Well, I think it also leads to this feeling of how do we feel good enough versus also sifting through what is our true ambition. And I say true ambition because I know, at least like I mentioned, so much of my understanding of what ambition was and setting goals was around my athletic identity. And then
Mm.
all this stuff happened, and then it's not that those goals weren't possible anymore. It's just I shifted my mindset around what ambition meant and what specifically feeling good enough again after trauma meant to me. And you mentioned poly strengths and sifting through that with people that are experiencing trauma or trying to get back to this feeling of just being enough. How do we make space for the goals that we maybe once had or pivoting around those goals? And also recognizing what you said. Hey, I got dogs to walk, and that's really important to me.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. I think that what you're touching on gets to one of the the parts of the points of the book that is most important to me, and it feeds into what you were talking about with social media too, that we are just so focused. And I think, again, this is like very typical of mainstream US culture, is that we're just constantly trying to regulate and do more and more and more. And we're, always trying to exercise more and eat better and, uh, you know, get our next degree or get our next book manuscript out or whatever it is that you're trying. And we're always like this very sort of goal oriented, but that doesn't turn out. I mean, if what you're trying to do is is thrive and flourish, those things are important, and we shouldn't try to drop those things, but we need to shrink them. We need to just make that one little bit of our lives and not our whole lives. And so in my model, in the resilience portfolio model, we make that just one out of the four domains, and the others are, so, which we call regulation, and the others are meaning making and relationships and your physical environment. And so, that does include things like my dogs. Like
Hmm.
honestly, my dogs are probably they probably contribute more to sustaining my day-to-day well-being than anything else in my life. And partly because they have to be walked, and they do get me out of the house, whether it's cold or rainy or I don't feel like it or whatever. And partly just because they're just such wonderful companions. And but I think that there's and again, I think a lot of this is more true in US culture and a lot of the other more capitalist cultures of the global north, that we think that more achievement is going to make us feel better, but and you know, it's not unrelated to that. But if you just I mean, I just feel like it feels like a movie cliche. Like if you just throw yourself into your work and you ignore everything else, then you're going to be miserable. Or if you just think about money and trying to make as much money as possible, that you're going to be miserable. And I feel like one of the things we've kind of lost in our society, uh, is is being able to recognize the difference. Because when I look at most extremely wealthy people, they all look miserable to me. I mean, they all just seem like they're constantly engaging in social comparison, and they have terrible relationships with their everyone in their family, and and I'm like, why? And I don't know why people look at that and they go, "I wish that was me." I'm like, why do you wish that was you? That looks horrible to me, and I
Well, I
think that
also,
we have to recognize that.
yeah, and I can't stand that. I think sometimes we label those people as the resilient ones. And that is, I think it's because it's formed of that old definition, which your book is fighting against. Because at the rate that I think we're going, it's not more is more is more. Because and when you the ways you're describing it too is people aren't thinking through things in a very thoughtful, researched manner anymore, and we're losing the depth. I think that how you have probably spent the last 30 years to understand not just resilience but vulnerability. And one of the things I loved was that you admit that it took you almost 30 years to share your own story in your work, and that's probably because of some of the format, like of academic work, that it wasn't necessarily part of it. But then, like with this book, when you're writing, you told your like your senior colleague, and they kind of were like taken back. And I wanted to just really just kind of end to understand, how did this specific book change you and the way that you exercise resilience in your life, and what it means for your work going forward now that you've put yourself out there.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I appreciate that question. When I started working on the book, I really thought that I was doing it for other people because, like I said, I see all of these people who need help and are getting what I consider outdated approaches to therapy. Like sometimes I tell the story, like if you had cancer and you went to see an oncologist, and that oncologist is like, well, I'm going to give you like the best treatment protocol that was available in 1990, the year I graduated from medical school. Like nobody would be like, okay, that's great, sign me up for that. You'd go and get a different oncologist. But we accept that with therapy all the time, and I think it's gotten very hard even for people in the field who aren't, like me, just like reading this new scientific articles all the time, to keep up with what's happening and to figure out how to integrate it into their practice. So I thought I was doing it for all those people. But in fact, I was really a lot more personally affected by writing the book than I expected to be. And and also just the editorial process. I know not everybody has this experience, but I just love my editor. I mean, they
Aw.
just, her name is Nina Rodriguez Marty at Fred Penguin, and she did such a great job of reading the book and helping me be like, oh, this goes with this, and oh, well, and the reason this is such a great example of this is because of these elements, and you don't have to, you're like helping me really like shape the story and the examples, and clarify the message. And at the end of it, I felt in this, I mean, it almost sounds kind of funny, but in a way, I felt like I understand my own work, that I, like you said, I've been doing for 30 years in a deeper and more profound way than by writing this book for a general audience than I had even. I mean, and I've written a lot of scientific papers. I have more than 200 scientific articles I've published. And so I do a lot of writing in this topic all the time, and still like coming at it from this different modality, I got a lot of personal benefit from it. And it also really was touching and moving to me in ways that I didn't really expect, to really revisit some of the people I've known who have meant a lot to me or who have made a big impression on me. And uh, so, yeah, it was really a wonderful experience. And I feel so much. And I do think in a lot of academic spaces, like that woman you mentioned in the book, that we are sort of taught to never talk about our personal lives. But in fact, I have found it really very empowering to be like, yeah, I have a life outside of work like everybody else. And I hope this is not too shocking to you, but bad things have happened to me, like you said, like have
Mhm.
happened to almost everybody. And I am a senior person in the field, and I do have a fair amount of professional capital, and I hope it makes it easier for younger people to not have to wait as long as I did to be able to bring more of the rest of their lives into their work, because I think it really holds the work back when we don't. I mean, you can't, because there's, in science, we always like to say that we're being objective, but there's no real objectivity. I mean, even
Right.
in chemistry and physics, they have acknowledged that you can't ever be completely objective, and that even just the way you set up the experiment is going to impact things. And so you
Mm.
can't really ever be totally objective. The only thing you can be is as self-aware as possible about what your subjectivity is and what you're bringing into it as yourself. And if you're not even willing to say that out loud, then like, how great can the work you do in this field be? And so I think it's really important that we change those conventions, and it has been personally really, like, more surprisingly wonderful than I expected to go on this journey myself.
I love to hear that. And I mean, I have a secret. If I could be in school for the rest of my life, I would, except I'm just not going to go into more student loan debt. But I think one of the reasons is because I've always have loved speaking with people like you, and that publish these very depth topics, and I but I feel like there's never really been such a great solution to finding that bridge between academic research and a book like yours. And I personally think, especially after reading your book, but many other books kind of in that same like breakdown process, is that personal narrative is that bridge. And so I think as we've discussed here, what are ways in which we can, whether it's on social media or human connection or both, deliver strong messages about the vastness of something like resilience. I don't think you can do it without personal narrative. And that's what makes it so powerful. So I'm so grateful for you for sharing your vulnerability and also all of your years of experience with us. I hope everyone goes and listens to this book. I'm going to be linking in the episode. But thank you, Sherry, for joining us today.
Oh, well, thank you so much for having me, and I love your questions. You've asked me several questions I haven't gotten very much, so I always really fun to think about things from a different angle.
I try. People call me very like bouncy brain. So, I never know what I'm going to ask myself either. It's just, I love connecting with people like you and people that are smarter than me. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah, I wouldn't want to say that. But I think that we all have been on our own journeys, and that we all have so much to share from those journeys.
Yeah. Well, guys, resilience is a big a part of the fabric of Sparkle On. Please watch this episode and listen to, or get the book by Dr. Sherry Hamby, Stronger Than You Think. Thank you. Sparkle On.
Thank you.
Inspire